Second Skin. Part 1. The Gift. It was a cold morning when David Brown received the letter. He had been waiting for it for months. The letter came in a plain envelope, and the words inside were short but life-changing. Congratulations, you are a match. Your surgery is scheduled. David had been sick for a long time. His organs were failing, and without a transplant he wouldn't survive. He had tried everything to get better, but now this was his only chance. He was nervous and excited all at once. The letter didn't say much about who had donated the organs. It was all anonymous. The only thing David knew was that someone had given their organs to save his life. On the day of the surgery, David was lying on a hospital bed, feeling weak but hopeful. The doctors and nurses were busy around him, preparing for the operation. As the anesthetic began to work, he felt his body go numb. He fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up, the surgery was over. He could feel something strange in his body, something new. He felt different, but he wasn't sure how. His mind was foggy, and he was still very tired. But as the days passed, he slowly began to recover. At first, everything seemed normal. David followed the doctor's orders, taking his medicine and resting. But as time went on, he noticed small things happening. He began to have strange dreams. In one dream, he was running through dark alleys, looking over his shoulder as if someone was chasing him. In another, he was sitting at a table, counting large amounts of money. David didn't think much of it at first. He thought it was just the side effects of the surgery or the medication. But then something even stranger happened. One afternoon, as he was walking down the street, he suddenly stopped. He had no idea why, but he felt a strong urge to turn around and go back. It was like something inside him told him to do it. A few days later, David went to the grocery store. He was just getting some bread when he bumped into a man. The man looked at him with a strange expression, like he recognized him. David didn't know him, but the man's eyes were full of fear. The man quickly turned and walked away. David felt a strange chill run down his spine. He tried to ignore the feeling. But over the next few weeks, these moments kept happening. Strange thoughts and feelings would come over him, and he would do things he didn't remember deciding to do. He started having an urge to drink, even though he never drank before. And sometimes he would get angry for no reason. These things felt out of place, and David couldn't explain them. One evening, as David was sitting at home, watching TV, he saw a news report. The reporter was talking about a man who had been caught in a huge crime ring. The man was a criminal known for his violent actions. He had stolen money, hurt people, and caused many problems. But what caught David's attention was the name of the man, Victor Hayes. Victor Hayes had died recently, but his death had not been explained clearly. David's heart skipped a beat. Something about the name Victor Hayes felt familiar. It was like it was connected to him somehow, but he couldn't figure out how. He remembered the strange dreams and feelings he had been having. He suddenly felt scared. That night, David lay awake in his bed, his mind racing. Could it be possible? Could the organs he had received belong to a criminal? Was he starting to think and feel like Victor Hayes? David didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more David thought about it, the more confused and worried he became. It felt like the line between who he was and who Victor Hayes was starting to blur. He didn't want to believe it, but every day, the signs seemed to grow stronger. Could the man whose organs he had received still be alive in some way? And if so, what did that mean for him? As the night grew darker, David knew he couldn't ignore these feelings anymore. He had to find out more about Victor Hayes. He had to understand what was happening to him. But the more he looked for answers, the more dangerous the truth seemed to become. And so, the strange journey of David Brown began. He was about to discover something he was not ready for. Something that would change his life forever. Part 2. The Changing Thoughts. The days after the news report seemed to drag on for David. But the strange feeling inside him only grew stronger. It wasn't just his dreams anymore. It was his behavior. It was as if he was slipping into someone else's life. He began to have flashbacks of things he never did, things he never even thought about before. The memories felt distant, like echoes of another time. It started small. One day, while cleaning his apartment, David found a hidden drawer in his kitchen. He had never noticed it before. Inside, there were stacks of cash, all neatly arranged. David stared at the money, unsure of what to think. He didn't remember putting it there. In fact, he had no idea where the money had come from. A sense of unease filled him. His heart raced. The money wasn't his. He had never been involved in anything illegal. But still, the sight of it didn't make him feel guilty. Instead, he felt a strange calm. It was almost like he had been waiting for it. He quickly closed the drawer, trying to push the thought away, but it lingered in his mind. As the weeks went on, the feeling that he was becoming someone else deepened. David started to experience sudden bursts of anger. His patience grew thin. He would snap at people for no reason, like the cashier at the store who accidentally gave him the wrong change. Normally, David would have let it slide, but now he felt a rage that he couldn't control. He yelled at the cashier, who looked confused and frightened. David left the store without a second thought, but the anger didn't leave him. It followed him. His thoughts grew darker. 2. He found himself thinking about violence, not just in his dreams but during his waking hours. He couldn't stop thinking about ways to hurt people who had wronged him, even in small ways. It wasn't like him at all. He had always been a calm and peaceful man, but now, every day felt like a battle to keep the rage inside him from spilling over. One evening, David decided to do something he had never done before. He went to a bar, even though he had never been much of a drinker. As he walked in, the smell of alcohol filled the air. The dim lighting made everything seem a little hazy, but it was exactly what he needed. He ordered a drink and sat at the bar, trying to calm his nerves. The bartender was a young woman, and when she handed him his drink, she smiled at him. David noticed how beautiful she was, but there was something about her smile that didn't sit right. It reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. Her eyes seemed to know something he didn't. As the night went on, David found himself drinking more and more. His thoughts began to blur. He wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't in control. In the back of his mind, he could hear a voice urging him to do something. It wasn't his voice, but it was familiar. It told him to take the money. It told him to take what he wanted, to take what he deserved. David didn't know why, but he found himself listening. He stood up and walked to the back of the bar, where a door led to the storage area. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. He opened the door quietly, hoping no one would hear him. Inside, there were boxes of supplies, but there was also something else, something shiny. David reached into a box and pulled out a small bag. His fingers trembled as he opened it, revealing more money, more cash, just like the money he had found at home. He could feel his heart racing. This wasn't him. He had never stolen anything in his life, but the voice in his head kept telling him to take it, to claim it as his. Before he could think, he grabbed the money and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He walked out of the storage room quickly, trying not to make any noise. As he passed the bartender again, she looked at him with a strange, knowing smile. David felt a chill run through him, but he didn't stop. He walked out of the bar and into the night. The moment he was outside, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. What had he done? He had stolen from the bar just like a common criminal. He tried to shake the feeling, but it was there, deep inside him. It was as if he was no longer the man he used to be. He hurried home, his hands shaking as he removed the money from his pocket. He stared at it, feeling sick to his stomach. He couldn't understand why he had done it. It was as if something inside him had taken over. The anger, the desire for control, the need to take what wasn't his. It all felt so new and so wrong. That night, David couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of Victor Hayes, the criminal he had learned about on the news. The name haunted him. Was this how Victor felt? Was this what he had been like? The more David thought about it, the more his mind started to piece together a terrifying possibility. Could the donor's organs have been carrying more than just life-saving tissue? Could they be carrying memories, emotions, or thoughts from the donor? David had heard stories about people who received organ transplants and began to feel different. But this was something else. This wasn't just feeling different. This was becoming someone else. The thought terrified him, but it also intrigued him. Was it possible that Victor Hayes wasn't dead after all? Was his mind somehow alive in David? Was he living inside David, using him like a puppet? David couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to find out the truth. He had to learn more about Victor Hayes and what really happened to him. And he had to figure out why he was starting to think and feel like the man whose organs he had received. The more David tried to control his thoughts, the more he realized that they were slipping away from him. The truth was just out of reach, and he felt like he was losing himself in the process. But one thing was clear: he was no longer the same man, and he didn't know if he ever would be again. Part 3. The darker side. David couldn't escape the feeling that something inside him was changing. The dreams were getting worse, more vivid, and more real. Every night he saw visions of Victor Hayes. Sometimes Hayes was standing in front of him, staring at him with cold, calculating eyes. Other times, David saw himself in Victor's place, committing violent acts, robbing a bank, threatening people, and even worse. David would wake up sweating, his heart racing, and his body trembling. But what frightened him the most wasn't the dreams. It was what was happening during the day. He felt like he was losing control. He started to make decisions without thinking, his body moving on its own. It was like he was no longer fully in charge of his own life. The urges to hurt others, to take what he wanted, were becoming overwhelming. One evening, David went to a small cafe near his apartment. It was a quiet place, one he had visited many times before. But this time, as he sat down with his coffee, something felt off. He couldn't explain it, but the air around him seemed heavy, charged with something dangerous. As he sipped his coffee, his mind wandered to Victor Hayes. He had been trying to find out more about the man whose organs he had received, but so far, there were only rumors. Most people who had known Victor were either afraid of him or simply didn't want to talk about him. But David was determined to know the truth. He couldn't keep living like this, not knowing what was happening to him. Just as David was lost in thought, he felt a presence beside him. He looked up and saw a man standing next to his table. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a rough look about him. He had the kind of face that made you think he had been in many fights. His eyes were dark, but they didn't seem friendly. They were full of something cold and calculating. "Are you David Brown?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. David hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, that's me. Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat down without asking. He looked around the cafe before turning his attention back to David. "I know who you are," the man said, "and I know what's happening to you." David's heart skipped a beat. How did this man know? He had never seen him before. "What are you talking about?" David asked, trying to stay calm. But the man's words made his stomach turn. The man leaned forward, his voice lowering even more. "I know about the transplant. The organs you got, they belong to Victor Hayes. And I know what's happening to you now. You're becoming him." David's mind raced. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man didn't answer the second question. Instead, he continued, "Victor Hayes didn't just die, you know. He disappeared. The doctors don't know it, but his body was stolen. Some of us, we know the truth. He didn't just give his organs to you. He's inside you. Those organs, they carry more than just blood and tissue. They carry his memories, his anger, his hatred." David felt a wave of panic. Was this man telling the truth? Was he really becoming someone else? Was he really becoming Victor Hayes? The thoughts terrified him, but they also made a strange kind of sense. All the feelings, all the anger, the strange impulses. It was like they were coming from somewhere deep inside him, something that wasn't his. Why would someone do that? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at him with cold eyes. Why? Because some people want power. They want control. Victor Hayes was a criminal, yes, but he was also a man who knew how to get what he wanted. And now he's inside you. He's using you. David stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. He couldn't listen to this man anymore. He had to leave. He didn't know what was real and what wasn't anymore, but he couldn't stand hearing this. Wait, the man said, his voice sharp. You can't run from this. You need to know the truth. If you don't, you'll lose yourself completely. The man you are now, he's not who you think he is. David didn't turn around. He couldn't. He rushed out of the cafe, his breath coming in short gasps. His mind was spinning. The world felt like it was closing in on him. Was it possible? Could he really be becoming Victor Hayes? The thought made him sick. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a murderer. He was just a man who had needed a transplant to survive. But now, everything felt wrong. He couldn't stop the thoughts, the impulses. They were stronger than him. As David walked through the dark streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following him. It was the same feeling he had had in his dreams. The feeling that someone was always just behind him, watching. He turned a corner and quickened his pace. But the footsteps behind him grew louder. Suddenly, someone grabbed him from behind. Before David could react, a rough hand covered his mouth, and he was pulled into an alley. He struggled, but the grip was too strong. He tried to scream, but the man's hand was too tight. "Shoo!" the man whispered in his ear. "It's me. The one who knows what's happening." David's heart was pounding. His mind was racing, trying to figure out who this was. But as the man pulled away from him, David saw his face in the dim light. It was the same man from the cafe. "You're not safe," the man said urgently. "Victor Hayes is alive. His mind is inside you, and it won't stop until it takes over completely. You have to stop him. You have to stop yourself." David was shaking. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "Who are you?" The man looked at him seriously. "I'm someone who's been tracking Victor Hayes for a long time. I've been following the people who have received his organs, trying to stop him from coming back. You're not the first." David's mind was in chaos. He couldn't think straight. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The man stepped back, pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was a small, black phone. "You need to find the people who took Victor's body. They're the ones who know how to stop this. You can't trust the doctors, David. They don't know what's really going on." David's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what to do next. But one thing was clear. He was in deeper than he ever imagined. The lines between who he was and who Victor Hayes had been were blurring. And the more he tried to stop it, the stronger the pull became. "Find the truth," the man said, before disappearing into the night. David was alone again, but this time, he wasn't sure if he could trust himself. Was he still David Brown? Or was he already becoming someone else? The darkness was closing in, and David knew there was no turning back. Part 4. The Secrets Beneath. David didn't know how much longer he could keep running. Every day, the changes inside him grew stronger. It was as though Victor Hayes's presence was growing, pushing its way to the surface. The worst part was that David wasn't sure where he ended and where Victor began anymore. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The face was his, but the eyes were colder, harder, like someone who had lived a life full of violence and anger. The man from the alley had left David with more questions than answers. Who had taken Victor's body? How was it possible that his mind, his memories were inside David? And what did he mean when he said David wasn't the first? David couldn't keep living like this. He had to find the answers, no matter what it took. He had to understand what was happening to him before it was too late. The first place he went was the hospital where he had received the transplant. He needed to speak with the doctors who had been involved, the ones who had worked on him, the ones who had given him new life. Surely they would have answers. But when he arrived, it wasn't as simple as he had hoped. The hospital was bustling with activity, but it felt different now. The walls, the hallways, everything seemed to close in around him. It was as though he was stepping into a place where he didn't belong. He tried to stay calm as he approached the reception desk, but the woman behind the counter looked at him with a strange expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, but her voice lacked warmth. "I need to speak with Dr. Mitchell," David said, his voice sounding steadier than he felt. "He was the one who handled my transplant." "It's important." The receptionist hesitated, looking down at her computer screen. "I'm afraid Dr. Mitchell is unavailable right now," she said. "He's out of town for the next few days." David's frustration began to grow. "I need to talk to him. It's urgent." The woman gave him a sympathetic look, but there was something in her eyes that told him she knew more than she was letting on. "I'm sorry," she said, not meeting his gaze. "You'll have to make an appointment." David turned and walked away, his mind racing. Why was she acting so strangely? It wasn't just that Dr. Mitchell was gone. There was something about her that felt off. It was as though they were hiding something from him. He left the hospital and went to the address the man in the alley had given him. It was a small office building in a rundown part of the city, the kind of place you wouldn't expect to find anything important. But David wasn't here for comfort. He was here to find answers. The building smelled like old paper and dust, and the air felt stale. David made his way up to the third floor, where the office was supposed to be. As he approached the door, he noticed that it was slightly ajar, the faintest hint of light coming through the crack. He pushed it open slowly, his heart racing. Inside, the office was small and cramped, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of papers. At the far end of the room sat a man in a chair, his back turned to David. The man was dressed in a gray suit, but something about him seemed familiar, even though David couldn't place it. "Hello," David called out, trying to steady his nerves. The man turned around slowly, and David's breath caught in his throat. It was the same man from the cafe. The one who had told him about Victor Hayes, the one who had warned him that he was becoming someone else. "You're here," the man said, standing up. His eyes were hard, cold, just like Victor's. David couldn't help but shiver. "I don't have much time," the man continued, his voice low and urgent. "You need to know the truth about Victor Hayes and what happened to you. And you need to understand what's coming next." David stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice tight. "I need to know. I can't keep living like this. I don't know who I am anymore." The man nodded, his face serious. "You're not the first to experience this," he said. "There have been others, people who received Victor's organs and went through the same thing you're going through. But there's something different about you, David. You're stronger than the others. That's why they came after you." David's confusion deepened. "Who came after me? Why me?" The man walked over to the filing cabinets and pulled out a thick folder. He handed it to David. "Victor Hayes didn't just disappear, David. He was a criminal, yes, but he had a plan. A plan to live forever. The organs he donated, he didn't just give them up freely. He made sure they went to people who could help him, people who could carry on his work." David felt a chill run down his spine as he opened the folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and medical records. The images were blurry, but they were enough to make David's stomach turn. They showed people who had received Victor's organs, people who had started changing in strange ways, people who had become violent, ruthless, people who had begun to act like Victor. "This is madness," David whispered. "How is this possible?" The man looked at him with pity. "It's not magic, David. It's science. They used a process, a kind of experimental surgery, to implant more than just organs into the people who received Victor's donations. They implanted his mind, his memories, and his desires. It's how he stayed alive. It's how he took over." David felt his world tilt. "You're saying Victor Hayes is still alive inside me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "That I'm becoming him?" The man nodded grimly. "Yes. And you need to understand something important. Victor isn't done. He's been waiting for this, waiting for you to reach the point where you can't control him anymore. He's inside you, David, and he's getting stronger." David felt the walls closing in around him. He wanted to scream, but all he could do was stare at the man in front of him. The man who seemed to know everything. The man who had been tracking Victor's every move. "But why me?" David asked again, the question repeating in his mind. "Why was I chosen?" The man paused, his expression hardening. "Victor chose you because you were weak. He knew you wouldn't fight him. He knew you'd let him in. And now it's too late. There's no way to separate him from you. David's heart sank. There was no way out. He was trapped inside his own body, caught between who he was and the man he had become. And every day, the voice inside him grew louder. Is there any way to stop this? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's eyes softened for a moment, but then he looked away. The only way to stop this is to destroy the source. You need to find the people who did this to you, the ones who implanted Victor's mind in you. They're the key. If you can destroy them, you might be able to destroy Victor. But you're running out of time. David stood up abruptly, feeling like the room was spinning. The man's words echoed in his head, but they didn't make sense. How could he destroy something that was inside him? How could he get rid of Victor when he was already becoming him? You're the only one who can stop him now, David, the man said quietly. But you have to hurry, before it's too late. David didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of what he had just learned was too much to bear. As he left the office, he knew one thing for sure. The battle for his soul had only just begun. Part 5. The Battle Within. David's mind was a battlefield. On one side, there was him, the man he had been before the transplant. On the other, there was Victor Hayes, the criminal whose blood ran through his veins, whose memories twisted through his thoughts. Every day, the battle intensified. It felt like his mind was constantly under siege, with Victor pushing him further into a corner. And the worst part was, David couldn't tell where he ended and Victor began. The more he tried to fight it, the more Victor seemed to take control. David could feel his personality slipping away, replaced by a coldness, a detachment that wasn't his. The anger he felt now wasn't the kind of anger he used to have. It was something darker, more violent. It was like he was being driven by an instinct he couldn't stop. Victor's past, his memories were becoming David's own. One morning, as David stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he saw something he had never seen before. A small, familiar scar on his right cheek. It was the kind of scar that couldn't have come from any recent injury. It was something he'd never had before the transplant. He didn't remember how it got there, but he knew it was Victor's. It was like a mark, a sign that the transformation was now complete. David pressed his hand to his cheek, feeling the raised skin. "What's happening to me?" he whispered. The thought of Victor, of becoming him completely, filled David with dread. He didn't want to be like the man whose memories now haunted him. He didn't want to become a monster, a man who had hurt countless others for his own selfish gain. But the more he fought, the more Victor pushed. It was as though Victor was trying to take over every part of him, every moment of his day. David knew he couldn't fight this alone. He had to find the people who had done this to him, the ones responsible for turning him into a living experiment. The man from the office, the one who had given him the folder full of secrets, had told him that the only way to stop this was to destroy the source of it all. But who were these people? Where could he find them? David sat down at his kitchen table, the file from the office spread out in front of him. He had read through it a dozen times, but it still didn't make sense. The records were incomplete, the information fragmented. He couldn't understand what the man had meant when he said that Victor's mind wasn't the only thing inside him. The man had hinted at something larger, something much more dangerous. As David's eyes scanned the pages, a name caught his attention. It was a name he had seen before, but this time it stood out. Dr. Gracefield. The name was written in bold, but the rest of the information beneath it was blurred. David couldn't make sense of it, but something told him that Dr. Gracefield held the key to all of this. He grabbed his phone and searched for the name. It didn't take long for him to find a research paper written by someone named Dr. Gracefield. The paper discussed controversial experiments involving organ transplants, specifically the transfer of memories through blood and tissue. David's heart raced as he read the paper. It was exactly what he had experienced: Victor Hayes's memories, his thoughts, and now his personality inside David's body. Dr. Gracefield was the one behind all of it. David's fingers trembled as he dialed the number listed for Dr. Gracefield's office. It rang several times before someone picked up. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered. "This is David Moore." "I need to speak with Dr. Gracefield," David said, his voice shaky but urgent. There was a long pause on the other end. "I'm afraid Dr. Gracefield isn't available right now. Would you like to leave a message?" "No," David almost shouted. "This is urgent. I need to speak with him now. It's about the transplant, about Victor Hayes. I know what you did to me." The woman on the other end was silent for a moment. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice suddenly cold. "I told you, I'm David Moore. I received an organ transplant from Victor Hayes." There was another pause. Then the woman spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come looking for us, David. You don't understand what you're dealing with." The hairs on the back of David's neck stood up. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "You think you can stop it, but you can't," the woman replied. "Victor is in you. He's never going to leave. And now that you know, there's no way to stop what's coming." David felt a cold chill wash over him. "What's coming?" he asked, his voice thick with fear. "You'll see soon enough. The process is already in motion. You won't be able to resist for much longer." The line went dead. David stared at his phone in shock. He was no longer just dealing with a transplant gone wrong. He was dealing with something far more dangerous. Victor Hayes wasn't just a criminal. He was part of a larger, far-reaching conspiracy. And now, David was at the center of it. He had to find Dr. Gracefield. He had to understand how to stop this before it was too late. But as he gathered his thoughts, the feeling of Victor's presence inside him grew stronger. The anger, the desire for power. It was like a wave crashing over him, threatening to drown him. David gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. He had to resist. He had to fight. But it was getting harder. Every passing day felt like a battle he was losing. Victor's memories were flooding in faster now, becoming clearer, more vivid. He could hear Victor's voice in his head, like a whisper, urging him to take control, to embrace what he had become. David couldn't hold it in anymore. He had to act, and he had to act fast. He grabbed the file, shoved it into his bag, and headed out the door. He didn't know where Dr. Gracefield was, but he knew one thing for sure. He would find him, even if it meant risking everything. As he walked down the street, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. His mind was no longer his own. And as the streets of the city blurred around him, he felt a cold rush of adrenaline course through his veins. He was ready to do whatever it took to take back control. But deep down, he knew it might already be too late. Part 6. The Final Transformation. David's feet moved faster as he walked through the busy city streets. But inside, he was slowing down. Every step felt like a battle. He had to find Dr. Gracefield, had to end this madness. His body, his mind, his very soul. They weren't his anymore. Victor Hayes was there, lurking in the shadows of his thoughts, pushing him, guiding him. David could feel it, a presence inside of him, like a second skin, and it was getting stronger. Victor's anger and ruthlessness were becoming part of him, like an infection spreading through his veins. He could hear Victor's voice more clearly now, urging him to act, to use the power of the man he had once been. It was so tempting. The desire to embrace this new persona was overwhelming. But David knew that doing so meant giving up everything he had left of himself. As he walked, the world around him seemed to fade. People brushed past him, but their faces blurred. The city noise became a distant hum in his ears. He was alone now, even in a crowd. It was as though he was trapped in his own head, caught between two identities. One was a man trying to save himself, and the other was a criminal with no conscience. David. Victor's voice echoed in his mind. David tried to shut it out, but it was impossible. It was like an itch he couldn't scratch, a voice he couldn't ignore. Why fight it? Victor whispered, his tone cold and mocking. You know what you really want? Power, control. It's all yours if you let go. David gritted his teeth, forcing himself to ignore the voice. He had to stay focused. He had to find Dr. Gracefield. That was the only way out. He reached the address listed for Dr. Gracefield. It was an old building on the edge of town, an unmarked door with a rusty sign hanging above it. The place looked abandoned, forgotten by time, but David didn't care. This was where it would end. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was stale, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with books and papers. It was the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in years. At the far end of the room, a desk sat in the center, and behind it, a man was hunched over, scribbling something on a piece of paper. Dr. Gracefield. He looked just as David had imagined. Older, tired, but with a strange intensity in his eyes. He didn't look surprised to see David standing in the doorway. "Come in," Dr. Gracefield said without looking up. His voice was calm, measured. "I was wondering when you'd find me." David stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm here to stop this," he said, his voice trembling but filled with determination. "What did you do to me? What's happening to me?" Dr. Gracefield finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he studied David. For a moment, there was silence between them, and then the doctor sighed, setting his pen down. "You don't understand, David," he said slowly. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last." David's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Dr. Gracefield stood up, walking over to a nearby shelf and pulling out a thick binder. He opened it, revealing photographs, files, and diagrams. "This," he said, flipping through the pages, "is the result of years of research. The transplant of memories. The transfer of consciousness. It's all possible, David. I've perfected it. But what you don't understand is that this process is irreversible. Once the memories are in, they take over." Slowly, but surely, David's breath caught in his throat. "So this is all you're doing? You've turned me into Victor Hayes?" Dr. Gracefield nodded. "Yes. I did more than just transplant organs. I gave you his memories, his skills, his traits. I gave you everything that made him who he was. And now you are becoming him." "No," David said, shaking his head. "I refuse to become him. I refuse to lose myself." Dr. Gracefield's expression darkened. "You don't have a choice. It's already too late. The transformation is nearly complete. The memories are already taking root in your brain. You can feel it, can't you? The anger, the hunger for control, the desire to dominate. It's all Victor's. And it's all yours now." David's hands clenched into fists. He could feel it too. The burning desire for power, the coldness that was creeping into his heart. He could feel Victor Hayes alive inside him, whispering, urging him to give in. But David wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. There had to be something he could do. There had to be a way to stop this. "I won't let you control me," David said through gritted teeth. "You already are," Dr. Gracefield replied with a sad smile. "But there is one way to stop the process. One way to break free." David's eyes widened. "What? Tell me." Dr. Gracefield's smile faded, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The only way to stop the transformation is to destroy the core of the experiment. The memory transfer device. The machine I used to make this possible. If you destroy it, the memories will be erased, and you will return to who you were." But what?" David asked, his pulse racing. Dr. Gracefield looked at him with pity. "It's not that simple. The machine is locked away. Protected. And even if you destroy it, you'll lose everything. Your memories, your personality, everything that makes you who you are." David felt a cold chill run through him. Was it worth it? Was it worth losing everything just to stop Victor from taking over? Could he live with that? I don't have a choice, David said, more to himself than to Dr. Gracefield. You do, the doctor replied softly, but you need to act fast. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to reverse the process. David turned to leave, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He had no choice but to destroy the machine, to destroy the very thing that had turned him into this. But as he walked away, he could still hear Victor's voice in his head. You can't escape me, David. You'll never escape me. David clenched his fists, fighting the urge to give in. He had come this far, and he couldn't stop now. He was not Victor Hayes. He was David Moore. He had to hold on. He had to destroy the machine. And he would. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more exciting tales. Check out our other videos for more great content, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for the next adventure. Thank you for watching.